18-year-old Indian prodigy Gukesh D is now world number 5. Let's look at his last game from the Olympiad 2024. So Fedoseev starts with d4. We have bishop f4, the London system, d5, e3, c5. Okay, normal development so far. And Gukesh goes for this interesting bishop g4 line. This is not the only line to play here. One other way is to play with e6. Let's say c3, and you have a very interesting idea with knight h5 here. Should white go bishop e3, you can play bishop d6 with knight f4 possibilities. This is just a line if you want to explore. There was a nice game that Caruana played after knight e5, knight f6, f4, and Caruana's idea was queen b6 because he wanted to take twice, in which case the bishop was hanging. So let's say if you made a bad move like g3, this is what Caruana wanted and you would gain a pawn. So this was one line which could have been tried. Instead, we have bishop g4, c3, e6, and queen a4. So the point with bishop g4 was that black got to play e6 and the bishop is not stuck inside. Now queen a4 makes quite a few threats. It is threatening bishop a6, bishop b5, and knight e5, attacking the bishop and the knight. So how do we defend all of these? This is where Gukesh plays a very interesting move, which is knight d7, and personally I think this is the best move. Reason being, it stops all these threats. Now bishop a6 is not that dangerous. I can even play queen b6 and there is no huge problem. And it also makes sure that knight e5 is now less harmful since the knight on d7 controls these squares. Bishop b5 is played. And now this is where Gukesh made a very nice decision, according to me, a very practical decision. Why? Because when you look at this position, you are most likely preparing against a move like rook c8. And I think what Gukesh played is not the main line. He played a move which is very possible, but probably not what Fedoseev looked at. Most likely Fedoseev looked at rook c8 with the idea bishop here, rook takes, queen takes a7, and apparently white has a slight edge here. This is what I expect. But Gukesh played the move queen c8, not playing the rook, but instead the queen. Now, if this is not the best move according to the engine, it is unlikely that Fedoseev looked at this. And based on the time that he took on the next move, I believe he did not. So Fedoseev goes for the plan with rook c1, and that's the move he played in the game. But he could have found the right idea by realizing that once the queen moves from d8 to c8, it leaves the h4 square vacant. It means that white can kick this bishop away to g6 and then play knight h4, winning the bishop pair in an open position. Since bishops love open positions, that's a sort of an advantage. Now you might think, doesn't that weaken the king by moving these kingside pawns? Not really, because this queen is offside. Let's say you played bishop e7, I could take and take. Now, one idea could be bishop f1, bishop g2, rerouting the bishop. The other idea could be to, let's say, play king f1, king g2, and I can argue the king is relatively safe. You could also play bishop e2, bishop f3. And yeah, the king is not in danger. That's the whole point, while white has the bishop pair. So in the game, we have rook c1, and this is the start of a wrong plan. White is trying to play c4, but he's not just in time for this. And Gukesh makes the best move, which is a6. He contests the bishop pair. Now, what do? If you go back, then your whole plan with queen was useless and black would just gain b5. So you have to take really to make some justification. And now Gukesh manages to trade the queens and he claims that c4 does not have firepower, and he's right in doing so. You can concretely calculate to realize that. So let's say c4, which was played in the game, we can just realize that there is no threat. If you ever take, I can take with the knight, and if you ever take, I can take back the c pawn. And yeah, the knight is just taking back. So what Gukesh does is he makes a prophylactic move with f6. It stops any knight e5s, and it also preparing g5 h5, potentially putting more pressure on that bishop. And he can afford to do this because his center is relatively solid and white does not have any significant attack. White tries knight b3, putting pressure on c5. But it's quite enough. Gukesh just goes for a5, targeting the knight. You can just play a4 and kick this knight somewhere. It must be noted that he does some good calculation here. You might think, isn't white just winning a pawn after taking twice? Not quite. This might seem like a playable move, but I think black can just take back with the c pawn. And yes, you can probably gain a pawn, but let's say with a position like e5, that bishop is not going to be working for the whole game. And this pawn will collapse since there is no one to defend it. I think one move could be something like rook b8, putting pressure here, let's say b3. And I mean, I could even think about maintaining a blockade here. Let's say something like this, for example. The pawn will be lost. As you can see, engine still gives black preference. Let's say you develop the bishop, play rook b6, gain this pawn, and that bishop is stuck for the whole game. So instead, we have h3. And now it's a bit late because now Gukesh just puts the bishop back. You could also taken, which is well worth noting. You could also go back to h5. All three moves were possible. King e2. a4, knight d2. So now that whole maneuver with knight b3 has been proved to be useless, while b2 seems like a reasonable target. And now if you look at this position and ask yourself, how does black make progress? You can't play rook b8 since the bishop is there. And yes, you could develop the bishop, but is there something better you can do? Apparently Gukesh does think so, and he plays the best move, which is h5. You are sort of preventing g4, which was white's only hope of getting counterplay. So even with advantage, Gukesh is looking at how do I minimize my opponent's counterplay, and that's why he's able to find a move like h5. Notice, without the queens on the board, black is not in a rush to develop his bishop. He can develop it on the next move. If the queens were on the board, there would be a more sense of urgency. Here, it's not the case. Bishop g3, bishop e7, rook c3, king f7. We still see that these knights lack good squares, and that bishop is quite active. So white is definitely making use of his bishop. Black is definitely making use of his bishop pair right now. Rook c1 and rook c8. Still, there is no meaningful threat on c5. I always have two defenders at least. dc5, white has to do something, and Gukesh plays e5. Now this is class. Not only you are refusing to take the pawn, you are essentially just blocking this bishop off from the whole game. And that is more important than material. Activity can be more important than material. So Fedoseev tries to win a pawn, and Gukesh does allow that. But then Gukesh claims, well, you have a pawn, but it's not going to survive for long, as I'm going to try my best to take it while your pieces just sit down. There is no square for the knight, as you can see. There is no outpost on the whole board for white pieces. And knights need outposts. So none of the three minor pieces are working for white, and that's enough justification for a pawn sacrifice. a3 is played, and now rook a5. Now this is another excellent move, because with a3, what white did was made b2 weak. And how do you target b2? You can put a rook on b5. So that's Gukesh asking himself the question, how do I best place my pieces? Knight e1, rook b5, and knight d3. So white thinks this is the only way to improve the knight. As Gukesh will tell you, not quite. He goes for d4. And it's a question, where does this rook go? Even rook lacks squares. So Gukesh made all of white's pieces lack good squares just by sacrificing a pawn. That shows his immense understanding of these positions. Took, rook c2, and we have rook e8. And this is pure brilliance. Not only you are just ignoring the pawn, since the knight always covers the c8 square, you are threatening various discoveries, all because the king has to be defending the d3 knight. Now, it's impossible to move this knight because the rook hangs, and it's impossible to move this king since the knight hangs. So white goes knight f3, his best bet. Gukesh plays rook b3. No need for discovered checks just yet because white will get king d2. And let's say if you were to play bishop b4 check, it allows some unnecessary compensation. Even though it's still winning, it might, yeah, I mean, it's still possible to play this, as engine tells me. You gain an exchange. Yeah, this was one way to win. Rook b3 was also very cute because it attacks d3 and threatens the same thing. Knight e1, bishop b4 check. And the whole point is bishop e1. Since if you take with the knight, the exchange hangs, and if you take with the rook, the knight hangs. Fedoseev took with the knight. That was the best bet. And this pass pawn will tell the story. Since c8 is always guarded, you can't really bank on this pawn queening. So it's just a matter of technique from now on. So knight e3, rook b2, c7, knight c8, h4, just desperate attempts, rook a2. Gukesh goes for that pawn, g3, rook b3, and eventually he just manages to convert. I think he played this rook e6 move, covering all the squares from the knight. Knight d2, rook b2, and eventually this was just wrap up quite soon. Let's just make the last few moves. And Fedoseev resigned very soon. I think rook e6, king d1, and rook b2. This is where Fedoseev resigned because rook e1 is pretty much unstoppable. If you play knight e2, I think rook c6 attacking the bishop, and actually rook c6, or I think rook b1. Yeah, rook b1. Rook b1 just wins because you gain the knight. Yeah. So this was like a very elegant piece of work by Gukesh, and I tried to point down some instructive moments in the game, especially the one with queen c8, which was a very practical decision, and a few other ones as well, how he managed to convert the technique where he sacrificed the pawn for blocking off all of white's pieces. That I think was quite instructive. Hopefully you learned something from the video and enjoyed it. Do let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll be happy to reply to any comments. Thank you.